Tonight, I would like to speak a little bit about why did Pharaoh's heart harden? Who here has heard the story of Moses and Pharaoh? The story is essentially about God's power over earthly rulers, no matter how powerful they may become. Moses, on the other hand, gave up to become the next Pharaoh and decided to serve God instead. He chose not to have his heart hardened, and he chose God over the physical world. Now let's step back a little bit and hear a little bit about the background story of Moses and Pharaoh. Moses, he was a Hebrew baby who was rescued from the Nile. He was adopted into the Egyptian royal household, where he learned of his origins and he began to take interest in his kin. One day, he saw an Egyptian maltreating a Hebrew slave. Moses killed the Egyptian and therefore had to flee Egypt, and he found refuge in Midian, where he became a shepherd for Jethro, the local priest. He married Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, and had 2 sons. Now, at that point, then he had an extraordinary encounter with God. He spoke to reluctant Moses, appearing to him in the form of a burning bush. God commanded Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh and lead the Hebrews to freedom. Now, at this point, Moses was a little reluctant in order to do this. How could a relative of nobody do such a thing? God continued to reassure him, and God would be at his side and give him the necessary courage and skills to carry out this difficult task. Now, reluctant and resolute at the same time, Moses returned to Egypt, and helped by his older brother Aaron, he faced up to Pharaoh. And one wonders how he gained access to his royal presence. He asked Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. Obviously and naturally, Pharaoh politely declined. Being facetious there. So ultimately, at that point, God and Moses decided to do the 10 plagues at this point. Now, as a sign they were backed up by an all-powerful God, Moses and Aaron engaged in a sort of contest of prestige with the court magicians. They performed a variety of miraculously feats designed to show the superiority of one type of magic over another. In spite of this, Pharaoh continued to refuse the decision for freedom, and the Israelites had to stay in Egypt. And what is more, they had to work harder ultimately as a result of this. Now, in response, God afflicted Egypt with 10 plagues. These 10 plagues were the river of Nile was turned to blood, there were frogs, lice and mosquitoes, flies, diseased livestock, boil on everybody's skin, thunder and hail, which destroyed all the crops, darkness, and ultimately death of every Egyptian's firstborn son. Now, one thing to take into consideration is once all these plagues happened, Egypt was never again a world power after this point. Now, at the beginning of the story, or towards the middle, God explains the mission to Moses. You're going to go back to Egypt and do all these wonders, and Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. Now, how is Pharaoh's heart going to be hardened? Ultimately, it's going to be by God's, and the situations and his disobedient heart that he had. Now, we may read that it may make us feel a little uneasy, and we may feel that is not fair. God is predicting that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. He repeats this prediction in Exodus chapter 7, verse 3, reminding us of what he is doing. In Exodus 7:3, it says, "But I will make the king so stubborn that he won't listen to you. He won't listen even when I do many terrible things to him and his nation. Then I will bring a final punishment on Egypt, and the king will let Israel's and his families and tribes go." God used his heart, Pharaoh's heart, to achieve his will and his plan. He knew that Pharaoh's heart was going to be hardened by all of this. Now, what we see from this passage is that God and Pharaoh, in a sense, are co-workers in this whole entire process. They're working together to harden Pharaoh's heart, just as he is working in us to work and to will for his good pleasure as we work out our salvation in fear and trembling. I do believe that what is in this text end up showing us. Both Pharaoh and God play a part in this whole process. With this said, I think we are incorrect when we look at the passage and say when God is doing the hardening, that Pharaoh has no part to play in this whole entire process. And that when Pharaoh hardened his own heart, God had nothing to do with the process in those occasions. Now, if we jump over to Exodus chapter 9, verses 34 to the end of the chapter, Exodus 9:34, it says, "And when Pharaoh saw the rain and the hail and the thunders that were ceased, he sinned yet more and hardened his heart. He and his servants, and the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. Neither would he let the children of Israel go, as the Lord had spoken by Moses. The Lord said to Moses, 'Go back to the king. I have made him and his officials stubborn, so that I could work these miracles.'" Now, both Moses and God were active in the process this whole way. It is really talking about two sides of the same coin. At times, one side is talked about more than one another. There is one passage in which we are told both God and Pharaoh did the hardening as described, as we just read in Exodus 9:34. We are told that God removed the plague of hail, and Pharaoh and his servants sinned, and they hardened their hearts. And in Exodus 10:1, we are told that God hardened their hearts. Well, who did it? Was it God or was it Pharaoh? They were both involved. It seems that God's part in hardening Pharaoh's heart was taking away the plague, knowing that it would have made him stubbornly to refuse to let the people go. But God ultimately was in control of the whole process. Now the big question here is, how did this work? There are times that it seems like Pharaoh is hardened because of God bringing these plagues. Sometimes it seems like Pharaoh is hardened because God lifts the plagues. And sometimes he is hardened because of the work of his magicians in copying these plagues. Sometimes Pharaoh is just plain stubborn and sinful, and he is hardened because of all this. These are all possibilities as to how and why Pharaoh's heart became hardened. However, ultimately, it was up to Pharaoh to decide if he was going to accept God or if his heart was going to be hardened. Unfortunately for him, he decided to choose the latter of the two, and this gave us the great example of the parable of Moses and Pharaoh. Now, earlier, before we started this sermon, we read Romans chapter 9, verses 19. And starting in Romans 9:19, it says, "Someone may ask, how can God blame us if he makes us behave in the same way he wants us to? But, my friend, I ask, who do you think you are to question God? Does he have the clay? Does the clay have the right to ask the potter why he shaped it in the way he did? Doesn't the potter have the right to make a fancy bowl and a plain bowl out of the same lump of clay? God wanted to show his anger and reveal his power against everyone who deserved to be destroyed. But instead, he patiently put up with them. He did this by showing how glorious he is when he has pity on the people who has chosen to share his glory." Now, in conclusion, since God has given us the free will to worship him or ultimately turn our backs on him, the decision is yours to determine if you would like to have your heart hardened like Pharaoh or become the child of God by becoming baptized for your sins. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. And think about which direction you would like to go in while we stand and sing. At any time during this song, you can come forward for the baptism and the remission of your sins.
There comes to my heart one sweet strain.